At about 5:05, I'll start putting a wrap on it, if that works for y'all. East Coast time. Okay. That was a very loud blue jay.
I had to close my window because I have so many birds like in the front and the back of my house, and they're just forever fighting.
I should declare that I do have 2 basset hounds. They're both sleeping, as basset hounds should, but at any time they might spring into action in a slow and deliberate way. So if you know a basset hound, so I'm just declaring that as a transparency point right now for me.
I see you and raise you a Dalmatian.
Ah.
A damnation. So.
Yeah.
I see you and raise you a poodle. Cross louch.
Poodles are smart.
I raise you all a chocolate lab puppy that can't handle to be away from his mother for more than 5 minutes.
Yep.
He's cute. That's all he's got going for him.
We have a Corgi mixed puppy that barks at himself, so I understand.
Someone said that they have a 2-month-old newborn and a 3.5-year-old child. You have us all beat, Allison.
Oof. Well, I think we're close enough to populating this that I want to go ahead and get it started. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for this rather unique World Urban Parks program. And we're so fortunate to have these great speakers with us today. Chip Nkabali from South Africa, Joburg, great guy I've had the opportunity to meet. I know you're going to enjoy hearing from him. Rob Small from the great nation of New Zealand. I believe, Rob, you're in Auckland and the beautiful island nation there. And then we have our friends from here in the States, at least just up north, Jessica Smith and Janet Naklia, who are going to talk to us stories about the Indigenous and First Nations of Canada. This is a special conversation really keyed up by a lot of what's going on in the globe and across the globe today. And originally our plan was to have this program moderated by Jermel Stevenson, who's the Parks Director in Corpus Christi, Texas, here in the States. Unfortunately, adding to his headache in 2020, his fine community was struck by a hurricane on Saturday. So I am the stand-in as the moderator, and I know our thoughts are with Jermel and his whole crew as they try to recover from a natural disaster on top of everything else we've been. If you're not familiar with World Urban Parks, we are really a collaboration of folks from around the globe who get inspired, get energy, and draw a lot of experiences like the one you're about to have from friends and colleagues across the globe. If you'd like more information on World Urban Parks, check out any of these social media platforms or our website as well. It's really not by any means a unique organization, but it is a unique gathering of folks who kind of act like COVID in some sick way. We really move quickly, vertically and horizontally across borders to take innovations, insights, lessons, ideas, and really encouragement from peers and colleagues the globe over. Our next World Urban Parks webinar after this one will be on August the 13th. This will be in partnership with our allies at City Parks Alliance, and this will be discussing managing urban biodiversity in a changing climate. And we'll bring in Yvonne and Herman from Mexico and Saudi Arabia, and then Karen from here in the States to talk about what cities are doing as they try to maintain ecological integrity within a very, very dynamic environment. So with that, I'll turn to our colleagues and we will get moving on this. I've introduced them briefly and then they'll each go through their stories. But before they start, I think it is important that we honor the elders or traditional owners of all the lands that we inhabit and maybe even where you're listening from. And we acknowledge that our time on this world and how we got here is a nuanced story at best and is a story wrought with controversy, conflict, hurt, pain, and suffering as well. And acknowledging those stories, I think, and I hope will inform our views and our discussion today. So with that, enough from me. It is my pleasure to turn it over to my dear friend Bishop, who is staying up late at 10 p.m. in South Africa and enjoying the winter down there. Bishop, take it away.
Good evening. My name is Bishop Ngobedi from Johannesburg. I'm the president of the Institute of Environment and Recreation. Also represent the World Urban Parks as one of the board members, and I'm responsible for the African region. As we all know, South Africa, we went through difficult times, which caused a lot of pain, a lot of injustice, a lot of inequity. But today I will share with you how apartheid in South Africa put the landscape of what's happening now and where we come from and where we are going as a nation. As I indicated, I'm the president of the IERM, and that's the two organizations that I represent today. Maybe just a brief introduction about apartheid in South Africa. Apartheid was a system of legislation that upheld segregationist policy against non-white citizens in South Africa. These policies or this law were brought in South Africa by the National Party government, where they use the city planning and how they want to divide the race. They use infrastructures like highway zones. They use infrastructures like industrial zones so that they can be able to manage these different races. Apartheid was a law in South Africa, and one that we're going to concentrate with today in terms of open space and urban parks is the Reservation and Separation of Amenities Act of 1953. This forced segregation in all public amenities, public buildings, and transport with the aim of eliminating contact between white and non-race, called Europeans only and non-European only sign were put in. So, which means for someone to understand what's happening, there were signs that were put in all the amenities in South Africa, so that people should be able to know that I'm not allowed here and I'm allowed into this particular space. What some of the signs that were put like this, where it said non-whites only, whites only, like beach and seas, whites only. So which means if you are found in the areas where you're not belonging, then you are punished. And these are most especially public amenities. So which means people of other colors were not allowed to access some of these amenities in South Africa. But today we'll talk about more on the public open spaces. Look at this, this picture. This shows the dividing line that this side, this is the boundary between white area and a non-African area. So which means you are not allowed to cross that border. So which means, look at this gentleman, he's sitting on the side. He's not allowed to move in that particular, even though he would love to go and enjoy those amenities in that particular side, but he couldn't because of the law. If he goes into that side, then he get punished for doing that. So those are the setup that we find. Look at this impact. This is one of the beaches around Durban, where it was put as a law that you are not allowed to use that particular area. That area is only reserved for that particular community. If you can see also on the other one, it said white area only. So which means this law and this signage were put in all these areas, making sure that the use of public open spaces is prohibited by those who wanted to have everything for themselves and not being able to say, let's enjoy this, all of us. Look at this mother. She took the grandson to this open space, but couldn't do that, couldn't be able to enjoy that open space because of the law that has been put in that particular area. If you look at these spaces, this is a park. These ladies are sitting, looking after the kids of the white people. But in that particular park, you're not allowed to use that particular bench. You can even see on the side, they are all sitting, all of them sitting down, because that bench has been written that non-white into non-white. So which means if you are non-white, you're not allowed. But if you are a white person, you are allowed to use that particular area. So their segregation didn't only go in terms of work, in terms of, but it went deeper into open spaces, that you are not allowed to enjoy these particular spaces in South Africa. This went for long and long and long before new laws come on board. But the segregation was so bad to such a way that people felt comfortable with this, to say, you know what, we'll rather sit down rather than being chased out of these particular spaces. Look at this, into how open spaces. One on the other side, you find people are congregated in one area where they don't even have any spaces. But you look on the other side of the fence, you've got huge open spaces which are there, which is a golf course. Then people are starting to say, but we need to be able to start sharing these particular spaces. We need to be able to use this particular space. By that time, you were not allowed to utilize these particular spaces. People tend to say, because we cannot get to and enjoy these spaces, then we will start using these spaces forcefully. People started building those shacks on top of that hilly area because they had nowhere to go. They didn't have space. They didn't have a place to stay. They said, but there's this ample open spaces which is there. Let's start utilizing those spaces so that we can be able to enjoy our life, because we couldn't do that. After post-Apartheid, what happened is that after post-Apartheid, after the democracy, they come up with a law called Special Planning and Land Use Management Act of 2013, SPLUMA. This act was aimed to develop a new framework to govern planning, permission, and approval, set parameters for the development, and provide different laws for the land use in South Africa. They started to open up to say, let's start using these spaces, let's start opening these spaces, let's start allowing people to use spaces, but in a lawful way, rather than people just go in and grab open space in it, but let's do it in a good way. If you look at parks in South Africa, the greener part is sitting in the white dominant area, which is the affluent area, but the brown still sits on the other side. And in some other countries, they said it must take you 10 minutes to walk through a park. In some areas in our community, there's not that 10 minutes. Some of them it took them an hour to be able to reach one spaces. Why that? It's because when we achieved democracy in South Africa, in terms of that special planning, we started moving that, but there's no land available in those particular townships. One of the persons said, you know, there was a 40-40 rule where your yard is 40 square meter, and it takes you 40 kilometers to go to work, to commute to work. So in terms of saying that I'm gonna be able to have an open space in my doorstep was not possible, because you are sitting in an area where it's much congested. And also, people that have started struggling a lot is the low-class people, because they are staying in those townships where there's not enough spaces. If you look at these three pictures, one on the far left of my side, it's one of the top suburb in Sandton, where it's greener, there's posh houses and everything. They've got ample spaces, they've got green spaces. They can enjoy those particular spaces. But if you look on one on the far right, it's brown. That's your township. We tried to put greening and say, let's green these areas and everything. But the way special was done in those years couldn't allow us. We started building parks, build smaller park here, build smaller park there, but there's no connectivity between those parks so that people can be able to utilize. The bottom part is informal settlement. Those areas where informal settlement, they are not allowed to stay there. So which means services are not that 100% provided to them. There's no space where we can be able to build parks. Now with COVID-19, how do you expect people that are to stay in that particular area to enjoy spaces? There's no space. That's the reason why most of the parks in South Africa during COVID-19 were closed, because we do not have enough spaces where people can be able to enjoy and spend time in those particular parks. That was because of the special planning that happens in the past. And it's our duty to go in to say, let's come up with ways, let's come up with plans. One day, if we achieve a picture like this where everyone comes together and we're able to plan our area, where we are not saying that we will do what apartheid has done, but we can go back and start re-engineering our cities. Make sure that we start putting parks in the right area, build large urban parks, connect all those up into parks, put all those amenities together so that people that never had those opportunities can be able to start have opportunities in their lifetime. Because if we don't do that in our lifetime, most especially now when we've got time to sit down and plan well, we're gonna go back to the drawing board and say we haven't done anything. And this whole, in the past weeks, there was a lot of news coming out of racial issues that have happened in the past. Those are the brewing part that is coming. And if we can be able to use open spaces, our parks, so that people can go there and enjoy, and have, and we all know what parks do to you as a person. But if people don't have that opportunity, they always think about what happened in the past, that will never have an opportunity to have parks. But it's time for us to build more parks, to look after the parks, so that we can create a better society for everyone. One day, as a young person, as an advocate for parks in South Africa, I'd love to see this picture, where everyone will enjoy these spaces, not only in the affluent area, but even in the township and the informal settlement, where they enjoy their spaces and they are able to recreate and enjoy. Thank you so much. I just hope that today we will have a lot of discussion around these issues so that we can unpack them and learn from other countries what they are doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop. Rob is getting his slides straight and together. So we learned that struggling with PowerPoint is not just an American strategy of Microsoft. The floor is yours, Rob.
Morena koutou, morning everybody. It's my pleasure to be talking to you today about a very important aspect, and one that pervades the whole world today. A little history about New Zealand and its history in terms of Indigenous people. The Maori people came to the Pacific to settle in New Zealand about 700 years ago. They came from a land they called Hawaii, which is a group of islands including Hawaii, the Marquesas, and the Cook Islands, but also probably had some origins in Tahiti. So they were here for about 700 years. They were great voyagers, and the Europeans arrived in the early 1800s. The Maori adopted to this new land and they returned to their islands. Some of those Pacific mariners were really accomplished sailors. They navigated by the stars, and their craft were a catamaran style, so they could speed across the oceans about twice the speed of the traditional sailing ships of the day. However, in New Zealand, like most places, the histories are written by the colonists, by those in power, and they determined that these people were savages and they could only be improved and changed from savages, if you like, by adopting a Western lifestyle. There were, in those early days, many cases of lawlessness among new settlers who were English, French, Dutch, all the European countries that were traveling around the world at that time. They were whalers and sealers, but they were also people looking to see what they could take back to the old country. The Maori people then were branded as savages early on with no regard to their property rights, while the Maoris themselves believed in peace and harmony and being good hosts, and at first willingly sharing their lands. One of the great myths, which is a story told by, if you like, the European world, is that Maoris were very ferocious. Well, I guess they were if you did them wrong, but in actual fact, they were people who had very strong values around hosting, around sharing willingly, around family and those kind of values. And Maori at that time had no concept of individual land ownership. They believed in plural land ownership. In other words, the land belonged to a tribe, if you like, or a sub-tribe. And they sought to have this unbridled greed and lawlessness by the settlers to be brought under control. So they did two important things. They were their initiatives. The first is a group of chiefs from the northern part of New Zealand, where my ancestry comes from, went to the UK, to England, to Britain, and with Queen Victoria signed a Declaration of Independence. And that was, while you can come and enjoy this land, we as a people are independent. The second main thing, and this was a really important element in New Zealand's history, is that they encouraged the government to, or the British to take administrative control over the country. And so the Treaty of Waitangi was signed on the 6th of February 1840 initially, and then signed throughout the island by different Maori chiefs. And unfortunately, it had two versions, an English version and a version written in Maori, and they said quite different things. And as time passed, as justice was seen to be done, then this was a very important issue in New Zealand's history. So after the treaty was signed, though, many lands were simply taken from the Maoris, and largely by the government. The leadership that changed the dynamics came first from the Maoris. So they were the ones that went and said, we just think that there's a huge injustice being done here. And so a revolution began in New Zealand, which was like a quiet revolution that saw the language, the Maori language, recovered. It saw traditional welcomes as an official part of most conferences, ceremonies, council meetings, many things. So it became a way of inculcating, I guess, what were the Maori culture of New Zealand into everyday life. And as a result, a tribunal was set up called the Waitangi Tribunal, because there was a recognition of the wrongs that had been done over the years. So many lands were returned, or otherwise financial restitutions were made. I'm working with and for a a tribe in central Auckland here, and they lost 300 acres of land, which was the prime land of Auckland. That is in spite of that tribe giving free access to another 3,000 acres, which became some of the wealthiest property in New Zealand. So the Waitangi Tribunal began to right some of those injustices and returned land. And as an example, the tribe that I'm involved with now received $18 million, but also received some essential land back. And they have now turned that $18 million into well over $1 billion in the space of about 15 years. So the Maori language is adopted as an official language along with sign language in New Zealand. Children can attend schools where only Maori language is spoken, and the syllabus includes Maori culture as well. People are integrated into society, the Maori people, and they're successful in all walks of life. But the important thing is that there is a recognition that there is a Maori worldview and there is a European worldview or a worldview. And these days, there's great respect given to the Maori worldview. And I think that's quite important. And I have to say that I think the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi and the either a deliberate or accidental effect that two different forms were adopted had the impact of creating this return to justice from the 1960s onwards. I think it's fair to say that extremists are inevitable, but most impactful in the lives, but mostly not impactful in the lives of these minority people. But prejudice still exists, and it always will, if you want my candid opinion. So what were the leaderships of change? I guess the real important for us as park managers is to understand that antipathies and prejudices that one race holds over another, or one group thinking it's better than another, often leads to conscious decisions that reflect that bias. And I guess if we think of the tinder that lit Black Lives Matter on this occasion in the US, that's very obvious. They're often reinforced by political leadership and a majority power construct, a worldview versus an individual minority view. And in New Zealand, or Aotearoa as we call it, these are British constructs. It takes strong, sensitive leadership that advocates on the part of all people in a community to turn these attitudes and behaviours around. These changes need to be seen as intergenerational. Role models within a minority group and with a dominant group can be very powerful influences. And the trick for many Maori people is, while we've had some activists, we certainly have had a lot of very wise elders who have acted with patience, with integrity, but with insistence. And it becomes like a call to action over time when this leadership emerges within communities. So let me talk from a parks perspective for a while. I think a similar response has been expressed in New Zealand to the colonial figures who may well have been slave traders or trangressors of some sort. And the question is, on this level, should these monuments and statues remain in our open spaces and in our parks? A contemporary worldview moves on, and in some cases, city fathers should show tolerance and justice if these are removed. But I think the reality is society is growing, and sometimes these monuments are not relevant in a contemporary society, and they should be removed. In other cases, maybe it's a question of a balance, or telling the story from both sides. From my point of view, I think one of the most important things that's emerged in New Zealand over time is that we have, in our parks, taken good care of understanding that there are The Maori people in New Zealand are the first people. And so while multiculturalism is important, and New Zealand is very multicultural, in fact, here in Auckland, we have the largest Polynesian population in the world. And so it flavors our whole society and it enriches us. But it's really important to understand how we adapt parks for those different cultures so that we can accommodate them all. I tell a story years ago of one of our most popular beachside parks here in Auckland when I was director, where when you went into that park, you could see a dramatic stratification of behaviour. And we were very well adapted to the European element of that, but not to others. So when I went into that park, which receives just over 1 million visits a year, a very popular beachside park, you would find that all of the Europeans were lying on the beach sunbathing or sunbaking, or maybe swimming, that the island groups and the Maori groups were playing boisterous games on the green spaces, pulling branches off trees so they could make nets for volleyball and those kind of things. And then you could notice the barbecues we had. There were people of the Indian subcontinent trying to cook a big pot of something on a barbecue, which was really made for cooking meat. And that behaviour said, we need to think about how we do these things quite differently. So let's actually provide volleyball poles. Let's understand that these groups are boisterous and make more room for them. And let's understand that we need to adapt our barbecues to include a gas hob or something of that sort. I think also when we do our park planning, we will always go and seek the local iwi or the local tribe's view first, and we will get their views on what some of the management practices should be. And then we take those views and our views out to the community for a wider world view so that we can blend the both. But in New Zealand today, I can say that, of course, prejudices still exist. But if you try and get into a course where they're teaching Te Reo Māori now, there's a waiting list. So people really want to adopt this language, which is beautiful. And I'd like to finish just by offering you what we call a hakatoaki, or a blessing in Maori. Hutia te rito i te harakeke, kia hea te komako e ko, e hi mai koe he aha te mea nui i te ao, mā ki atu he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. And what that means is, as we go through life, we ask questions. And one of those is, what is the most important thing in the world? And I will always answer, it's people. It's people. It's people. Kia ora, kia koutou, kia kaha, kia manawa nui, kia maia. Thank you for listening to me, and greetings to you all. Ngā mihi.
Getting my PowerPoint here.
Right. So just so everyone knows, we are Team Awesome, Jess and myself. So you'll be hearing from the both of us. All right. So who are we, Jess? Want me to go? You go first.
Doesn't matter.
You go first.
Uzu, everyone. Kimawe Niape Esqueo Nosum. I'm Rainbow Woman's grandchild, or Jessica Smith. I recently have been honored with the position of manager within the Boys and Girls Club for our Igakimat, Home Fire, and Aura programs, serving Indigenous youth, non-Indigenous youth, in a variety of ways, through homelessness, through healing, and protecting identity. I am Ojibwe and French Canadian. I was born and raised in Halifax, Nova Scotia here in Canada, and that's the traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq. My parents, my mother is from New Brunswick, which is the traditional territory of the Maliseet and the Mi'kmaq, and my father is from Ontario, which is the traditional territory of the Ojibwe. I'm also a university student, a board member for the Indigenous Gathering Place in Calgary, and that's a little bit about who I am. Janet?
Thanks, Jess. So my name is Janet Naklia. The spirit name that was given to me is Natuipita Aki in Blackfoot, which is the traditional territory of which we're in. Muskiki Kihuasqueo in Cree, which means medicine eagle woman. I'm the programs manager for Alberta Recreation and Parks Association, which is also the Secretariat of World Urban Parks, which explains a bit of our connection here to the webinar today. In terms of where I'm from, so I'm originally born in Fort McMurray, Alberta, which is the northern part of Alberta. For transparency's sake, when we're dealing with these kind of contexts, I am a Ukrainian descent, so I'm non-Indigenous. In Canada, then we also will say often, so I will declare that I'm a settler. I have a colonizer background as well. And I'm an ally in the work that Jess and I often do together as our partner organizations. But another thing we often say is that it's not enough to be an ally anymore. It's about moving into accomplice state. So I think at this point, I'm doing a lot of accomplice work, and I'm also on the Indigenous Gathering Place board with Jess as well. We do many things. Team Awesome does many awesome things together.
So we're kind of going to go over a couple things today. We wanted to touch briefly on what our shared history looks like in a very brief nutshell here in Canada. Specifically around the TRC, what our collaboration is between Janet and myself and other organizations that we work with, and also how are we making this work.
Awesome. And so I wanted to thank Rob actually for that blessing and the greetings, because it's also become a practice here in Canada to also do a greeting or a blessing or a land acknowledgement, also called a territory acknowledgement. And so this is what Alberta Recreation and Parks uses officially in our gatherings, our openings, our email. So I'm just going to read it out for you, and then Jess will talk about the significance of why we do this and how it relates to our discussion today. So the Alberta Recreation and Parks Association would like to acknowledge the First Nations, the Métis, and all of the people across Alberta who share a history and a deep connection with this land. We dedicate ourselves to moving forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in the spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. And I also would like to acknowledge that I am based here in Calgary, which is called Mohintsis in the Blackfoot language, which is a traditional territory of which I am sitting on today and honoring.
Hey. So really a land acknowledgement is a traditional recognition of the land that we're occupying. So a long time ago, when we would go into another area of land, we would acknowledge the people who were there, the nations that resided there, because we are stewards of the land. So we are not owners of it. We don't see ourselves as this is our territory. We all have a duty to protect the land that we're on. And so that's really a part of it in a traditional sense. In a more modern sense, the land acknowledgement has been brought back as part of the TRC around reconciliation to really honor the first people who were in this land. While there were documented reports of North America being visited since 1000 AD, there were people who inhabited this land for as long as we can really fathom. And so it's really important that we pay attention to those pieces because the land had been taken and still continues not to be occupied in the way that it once was. So we're going to talk a little bit about the TRC, but I wanted to give everyone a bit of context around what occurred here in Canada. And this video does a really great aspect to that.
Reconciliation. It's a word you often hear, especially when discussing the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. But in light of recent events, some aren't sure they even want to talk about reconciliation anymore. When a 15-year-old Anishinaabe girl was found dead, dumped in a river, and no one was held responsible, and a young Cree man was shot dead and the shooter was acquitted. Both of these recent cases have re-exposed a deep rift between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada. It's a divide that goes back hundreds of years. When Europeans arrived in North America and began settling the land, they didn't stop at just taking land from Indigenous peoples. They brought with them a policy to snuff out the so-called Indian problem. The first Indian residential schools started opening in the 1870s, the beginning of what some have called the darkest chapter in Canadian history.
What took place in residential schools amounts to nothing short of cultural genocide.
By 1920, the Indian Act was amended to make it mandatory for status Indian children to attend residential school. When their parents refused to send them away, police showed up and forcibly took them. It's estimated that 150,000 children were taken from their families and placed in these schools where they were stripped of their culture and their language. The goal was assimilation, to quote, kill the Indian in the child. Thousands of children died, with some estimates saying the mortality rate was as high as 60% in some of the schools. Those who survived have shared horrific stories of physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. The last residential school closed in 1996. The impacts of those institutions are still palpable today. Indigenous communities have shown incredible resilience in the centuries since Europeans arrived, but the impacts of intergenerational trauma and colonization still run deep. In 2007, the largest class action settlement in Canadian history recognized the damage inflicted by residential schools. Canada formally apologized the following year.
These objectives were based on the assumption that Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Indeed, some sought, as was infamously said, to kill the Indian in the child. Today, we recognize that this policy of assimilation was wrong, has caused great harm, and has no place in our country.
The residential school settlement agreement established a multi-billion-dollar fund to support survivors in their recovery. One of the outcomes of this agreement was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The commission traveled across the country and heard testimony from thousands of residential school survivors. In 2015, the commission produced its final report. It included 94 calls to action, calls meant to redress the legacy of the residential school system, and hopefully lead to reconciliation. So what's changed since then? Some ask if this country has even grasped the truth of our shared history. What actions have been taken? How far have we come? Indigenous people currently account for roughly 5% of the population, and yet nearly half of all the children in care in this country are Indigenous. More than a quarter of the adults locked up in prisons are Indigenous. The national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls may be well underway, but the deaths and disappearances continue today. It's time to take a hard look at this country's progress on reconciliation.
So I know that that's a really heavy video, but we want to talk a little, we wanted to make sure that folks understood the impact that has happened to Indigenous people and the purpose behind the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So like the video said, it was very much a document that was developed as a result of the trauma that occurred to Indigenous people in residential schools. And it's a true thing. It's a story of our survivors and their experience, but also the calls to action are meant to hold accountability to all levels of government, all systems that affect Indigenous people, whether that be education, justice systems, and so on. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was developed and led by 3 commissioners. So Justice Murray Sinclair that you've seen in the video, Wilton Littlechild, and Marie Wilson. So these leaders made sure that this was done with the truth in mind, but also with the Indigenous perspective held. And so we had our residential school survivor committee that provided advice and support to the commission. And it was also guided by 7 sacred teachings, which include respect, courage, love, truth, humility, honesty, and wisdom. And those are sacred teachings and values that are passed on generationally from a traditional perspective through stories and oral practice. And one of the biggest pieces that we want to make sure that people understand is that reconciliation isn't just an apology and a recognition of what occurred, but the actions that change how we move forward together. And so currently, we see many changes happening. A lot of the work that Janet and myself and our agencies do is really geared towards that reconciliation and the action behind those truths. But a lot of places we're still seeing, I guess, that face value. And so we want to really drive home the importance of these components. And so here's a little bit of statistics for everyone to kind of see how you would compare something like a residential school to, say, the war, right? So our beautiful collaboration, this is you know, despite the hardships, there's always beauty in everything.
So thanks, Jess. So there was a question I just saw in the chat box about management. So Alberta Recreation and Parks Association, we don't have Indigenous managers within our organization. We are very mainstream. But when the TRC came out, it's an interesting thing, only 5 years ago. So we've done an amazing amount of work with Jess in those past 5 years. We came together to talk about what can we do, because there were recreation, sports, parks related action items within the TRC. While we don't have management that's Indigenous, one thing that is a huge blessing to ARPA is that we work with a group of elders. So we've established genuine relationships with a group of elders through 2 main elders, Dr. Reg Crowshoe and Rose Crowshoe, who are Blackfoot elders and traditional knowledge keepers and bundle holders. They have an interest in parks and in recreation. And they have also developed brought a group of elders together to create capacity within the elders because of a loss of capacity due to residential school. Because they were taken away from their family and their communities, a lot of this information was lost and this knowledge wasn't passed on. So the assumption that someone is older, so they're an elder, is a very an incorrect one. And so elders almost had to be taught how to be elders again because of this impact that we've had through the Canadian actions and the residential school system. So we came together, and one of the things the elders said was that it's great to grow capacity within ourselves, but we also need to teach the youth because they're the next elders in the making. And this brought us to, and we actually have a video that we're going to show you because the elders tell you the story better, but this brought us to Jess. So Jess has connections to the youth. We partnered with Muskanawa, which is like a family serving social services program within Urban Center, which is Calgary. And we came together to create this culture camp so that the elders and the youth can connect to the land. And the interesting part about this is we weren't able to do it within an urban setting because of bylaws and restrictions and elders who did not trust the system because of what has happened in the past. So we were able to tap into Jess and a campsite that they happen to have through their organization. And so I'll pass this on to Jess to show us the video because the elders really tell the story of how this journey, as all these organizations came together to work with the elders as part of reconciliation.
That's how we were taught. Oral, through stories.
The land is where we come from. We don't own the land owns us.
If you could teach the kids the differences of the land and how they relate to that specific tribe or people there, that's how you learn the history of those people. And the same thing about to the prairies. You teach them why it's flat and why we use those, why we camp by the rivers. That's very important for these kids to learn that that's where the power comes from.
My name is Reg Crowshoe, and in our language, which is Blackfoot, my name is Awakasina, which means deer chief. I'm from the Piikani Blackfoot First Nation. We're a verbal society, and we navigate oral practices for rights and privileges. And out of oral practices, songs become our physical documentations to prove those rights and privileges.
Our teachings have been passed down to us generation after generation from our ancestors to our elders that we have today. And they're not passed down through pictures or audio or anything like that. They're passed down through nature, the land shapes, significant landmarks, and of course our oral history.
So I think it is important right now that we're losing our songs, we're losing our language, because we don't know oral systems. And it's so important to have a camp or something where we can bring our young people to start teaching them about oral systems.
It's very hard for us to learn from a book. Yeah. But when it's shared with stories, creation stories, then it really sticks to us.
It's hard to be gathered as an elder everywhere. Although we go to schools and universities and do our part, the camp gives them a freedom to learn properly and to be on the land and to learn from the land.
It's a missing link for the young people today, especially living in the city of Calgary. They're not exposed to this.
To hear them laugh, to hear them play, and go through things in the camp where, yes, it's rainy and it's cold and stuff, but you're going to go through challenges in your life, and how are you going to deal with them? When you don't have a good, strong foundation, a lot of our young people give up, which is very unfortunate.
I believe it's important to practice our Indigenous ways of knowing to keep them. I really believe in, working with your elders and hearing from them and being close to them, creating relationships with them, because we are the future. Indigenous youth, our youth are the future, and we want to continue the stories, the teachings, and the songs to live a prosperous life, of course, to live our ways and to not lose who we are.
So ARPA, we're a provincial-based organization whose mandate is to use recreation and parks, culture and wellness as a catalyst for change in community. So a few years ago, we connected with an elder named Dr. Reg Crowshoe. And Reg has been doing some work with elders in the Treaty 7 area, particularly in Calgary, to bring elders together to create capacity within the community. And one of the priorities that came out of this work was a youth and elder-based culture camp on the land. This project has been done in collaboration with the Boys and Girls Club of Calgary, as well as Pathways, because their goal is also to connect elders with youth.
We're at a critical time. We're losing the Indigenous resources. Our elders are passing on and dying off, and they're leaving us with shortage of human resources to help our young people. So I think not only do we take the young people and work with them, but we need to teach our own young elders to become full-fledged elders and validate it so that they can continue supporting organization.
So that speaks volumes to the work that we're doing now and the importance of that work.
And just as I said, so I think part of our successes would be the fact that we have done a genuine collaboration based on relationships that brought these organizations together with a similar purpose. And I think that has just allowed us to do this amazing work that has an impact because we all knew the value and would do whatever it took to make that happen. Also, as I mentioned before, you know, thanks to Jess and the organization for having a campsite, because we did have conflicts around the elders not trusting park officials within the city and in provincial parks because of past encounters with racism, and the elders remember. And so that kind of is an interesting challenge for us. And then also an interesting pivot is due to COVID. We are going forward with a camp in a few weeks in a safe manner, but we've also been doing online work, trying to, realizing that that's our current situation right now. And we have to be aware that COVID has its own unique challenges and to be creative in that environment as well. And then I'll leave the last words to you, Jess. Yeah, anything to add to those?
No, I think that we're good, and I think we've run out of time, so I apologize. But this is our contact information. We're always open to questions and collaboration, so please reach out to us if you have any questions.
Great. I know everyone appreciates that. Thanks, Jess, Janet, Rob, and Bishop. We have set aside, we had the ability to go a little longer with this because we wanted to allow folks to engage. So I encourage folks that are listening in, make use of that chat box to get questions to the panelists. It's kind of unique to have this many voices together at one time. I'll tee it up and I'll come back to Bishop to start because he picked up on a theme that was then picked up. To the park managers that are in the audience, what would you tell them tactically? How do you make your parks and your resources more accessible, welcoming, safe to people of various backgrounds, some of which may have cultural barriers and may have had experiences in these landscapes where they were not welcomed? Do you have any instructions or advice you'd give to folks about making their parks more welcoming?
I think one thing that I think Commissioner Silva from the New York Parks always say that are we distributing our resources fairly? I think that's a key setup. If we start going back to how the system works in terms of distributing resources, where all those underprivileged communities, they not get anything because of the system. Let's come up with a way to say, let's change the system where we are able to empower those communities because they have nothing. They have nothing. If we put resources in a fair way, then and it's us park managers. There's no one who can blame to say, no, I didn't develop that park, because it's us who are not distributing our resources fairly. But as I said, park managers, let's distribute our resource fairly. Let's make sure that we empower those who never had, and make sure that we link those who didn't have and those who have, so that we can be able to have a very good community. So I think firstly is to allocating of resources. Let's do it fairly. Let's make sure that we sit down and say, yes, I've done it fairly. And as Commissioner Silva always says, let's make sure that those who never had have something.
Rob, you want to take a swing at that?
Yeah, look, there really are no barriers to access in New Zealand for any people. So it's not a question that I'm easily able to answer. I mean, it needs to be understood that from the very outset, in spite of some of the land dispositions and some of the prejudices, there have always been, as of right, 4 Maori members of parliament, for instance. So there's never been a segregation other than those which are attitudinal. And I think for us, the big challenge has been to change the attitudinal segregation. That comes down to, as I said before, sensitive, thoughtful leadership. So that should come from your president, from your prime minister, it should come from your mayor, it should come from your chief executive of companies, it should come from the parks leaders.
Yes, Janet?
So I would say that going on with Rob was saying attitude, and I think Jess could, speak to this as well, but I think education is very key within our park systems. And so like within like the Indigenous construct, their treaty has been made. Like there are things where there's access to hunting rights, harvesting an animal, say it gets hit by a car, medicine picking and all those kind of things. But there's within the park systems themselves, if the wardens and the managers don't understand these treaty rights, then they will stop people from doing those things and the conflict arises. And so I think basic understanding, cultural awareness for all staff is very key in, here in Canada. Not as much as we'd like to see, to be honest. But I think if those people don't understand the treaty rights to Indigenous people within those park systems, and they're violating those rights and are wondering why people are upset and why the elders are upset because this has happened to them for generations, until those basic things like that happen, that's what's needed, I think, for significant little steps towards significant change. I don't know if Jess wants to add to that.
I think you spoke very honestly to kind of the current issues that we see, and I really think that it's important that we understand how, I guess, thought process and history of trauma affects the way that individuals move in the world. And so access to space is crucial, but identity in that space has a lot to do with it as well. So, when I walk through this world, I'm very white presenting and not often taken as an Indigenous person right away. But when I see, my friends and my family on the land, there are instances where, we're asked to move or shift or not access the land in the traditional way that we see fit. A perfect example is medicine picking and needing a permit to do so. So we pick for various things, for various reasons in our culture, and they're different plants that have been naturally occurring to this land as long as we know. And because of the way that structure works within a community, often we have to call into the city of Calgary to say, hey, we need this permit to be able to pick this medicine that our people have been harvesting forever, for as long as we know, right? Or as long as anybody has documented, at least. So I also think that it's important that perception is taken into account for this as well when walking into a space that also already has systemic racism through generations, and then being that Indigenous person trying to re-access that space is not easy. So there has to be, I guess, that advocacy on the part of officials to be able to ensure that education is happening, so that shifts in mentality and really like an overall shift happens.
Great questions. I want to pick up something Lewis asked on here. I'm going to take a very direct spin with it. And Rob, we'll start with you and then go to Jess and Janet, then to Bishop. Let's talk about legacy landscapes and let's really drill down. How have each one of your countries dealt with statute and naming that carries values from a past society that are not acceptable today and that we recognize as being offensive? That's obviously a hot button here in the States, but we're not the first ones to deal with this. So Rob, for, I don't want to jump across the river a little bit, but how maybe Australia deals with Cook, and thinking through these things as park managers, not maybe the advocates, but the park managers have to deal with these very precise and directed discussions.
Well, it's an interesting one. I think a counter to this whole discussion about, the whole thing of markers on the land, if you like, there's been a real resurgence of carved, we call them popo, or carved poles, if you like, across the landscape in New Zealand. And I'm proud to say that Auckland Regional Parks, when I was director, was a leader in that. When we talk about other markers that become unacceptable, I think we do have to understand that the world moves on and we become enlightened, and as a result of that, we do need to remove some things. That's my candid view. I think it's really important to be honest about these things. And, you know, I'm no stranger to weathering the controversy of community opinion, but in the end, I think we have to do things that are right. And if you can't figure that out, well, you're in the wrong job.
So I think like there have been statues like removed from various places across the country, and like even I know even here in, it's interesting, even here in Calgary there's a bridge that they recently renamed Reconciliation Bridge, and it's funny because they brought the elders together from different nations and they couldn't quite decide on a name, and the elders decided themselves, well, let's just recognize the fact that this is called Reconciliation Bridge. But there have been definitely a lot of movement towards naming places, communities based on traditional names. And it's not just Jen said, just like Jess said, like some sort of nod to things, like genuine consultation with elders as to what a place has been called or should be called, and what that really means and the education around that point. So not just kind of a casual handshake, it's about what is the true significance of that. And I think even what Jess was saying about land acknowledgement, we're even hearing now, 5 years into TRC, that you just can't acknowledge the land. Like, you know, it's all about what it means to you, the story, like that soul story of a place is being acknowledged more and more. So opposed to paying lip service to something, we're talking about like owning your truth and understanding the original voices of a place. And I think that is something that I've been definitely seeing as well.
I think in South Africa, in the past few years, there has been demonstration in terms of removing statues that represented colonialism in the past. Some of them, they've been removed from public open spaces, public buildings. But I think the biggest fundamental is when segregation happens in South Africa, people kind of like locked in that particular area where they put roads around it. So if you stay in that area, you are kind of like in a small box where you don't have spaces, you don't have anything, compared to in affluent area where you've got streets that goes up and down. In some of the communities like Soweto, you only find 3 or 4 roads that comes into that community or that goes out of the community. So that law wanted to understand and monitor the movement of non-white people in that particular area. So I think we need to go back and say, and also one thing that I've learned was when we develop new spaces in those communities, we didn't go in and say, okay, what do you want to see? We developed those spaces where you put swings and roundabout and everything. We never created space for people. So I think going forward, it's time for us to revisit that and say, how do we build spaces so that the people can be able to enjoy post-COVID-19? But it's time for us to talk about this. It has been put around under the carpet, but I think it's time for us to take our statues and everything and store them. It is demonstration, but what are we going to do about it going forward? Yeah.
We've got about, I want to give you plenty of rope to share your wisdom with the group one more time. And maybe let's try it this way. I'm going to put you on the spot again. What would you say to a parks professional, let's put a young parks professional who wants to get busy about the business of healing through parks, wants to get busy about racial reconciliation, wants to get busy about righting wrongs and leaving a better future, using Rob's language of, I think you said, strong and sensitive leadership. what would you tell that young professional? Let each one of y'all do a little riff for a second. You can act like a Baptist minister if you need to, but what would you tell to that young parks professional that wants to make a difference in this space and to give them some encouragement? And let's start with, we didn't start with Janet and Jess. So we'll start with Janet, Jess, then Rob, then Bishop.
I will leave this one to Jess.
Honestly, I think that the biggest piece of advice that I would give young people coming into the work that we're doing is really to build relationships. I don't think that as an outsider coming into an Indigenous community, that you just have this understanding, maybe because you learned something in school or you watched a documentary and things like that, but you can get a really deep understanding through relationships, through understanding culture from that perspective. And so one of the things that I value the most about Janet is that work, that relationship work that has been done with the most sincerity, not to come in for her own needs, but really to create the space for Indigenous people to be well on the land. And so if you're going to do this work and you're going to look at your policies and shift your thinking to a more advanced and leave what happened in the past behind and genuinely do that work, you have to start with listening to the people that are affected the most by the policy. And these are often the individuals that are dealing with the systemic racism that the government policies affect the most, individuals in poverty, minority group. So all of those things are kind of extremely important to take into consideration, but you cannot get to the root of those causes without those relationships.
Look, for me, I think some of the most important issues are if you don't understand the problem, you can't solve it. So as Covey says, start with the end in mind. So, I think it's really important that you go and first of all, talk to the people who are most effective and put yourself in their shoes. The second thing that I have found useful in my career is to find mentors who you admire, who actually have solved some of these problems. I've been very fortunate with the mentors I've had. Professor John Crompton from Texas A&M University was somebody who taught me a good deal, and the late Brian O'Neill from San Francisco from Golden Gate National Parks were two people that I talked to regularly, and they were extremely helpful in my career. So they're the two things I'd say: understand the problem, then try and see that worldview, the view of the affected parties. And because, that's one of the things I've learned most in New Zealand about reconciliation with Maori people, but not just Maori people. It's people who come from Afghanistan, who have been refugees, or other people, is they have their worldview. And one of the great mistakes that's been made by colonisation is to assume that the colonial view is the right one and that the Indigenous worldview is the wrong one. And so they've labelled people as savages, unintelligent, unworldly, I suppose, in a way. And yet here was a nation of Maori who were extremely intelligent, who were some of the greatest mariners who ever sailed the earth, and who were definitely not warriors. They were really gardeners, those folks. So it's understanding the worldview of that group that becomes pivotal if you want to find resolution to the problem. And the second thing is never do it on your own. There's always people with a sympathy for those causes. Collaborate.
I think for me, the advice to young park manager is understand your community. understand what your community needs, understand what type of parks you want to build for that particular community. The moment you have identified a space where you want to build a park, engage the community, engage the elders, and understand what happened in that particular space. There's spaces that have got a huge significant value, most especially in terms of history in South Africa. Understand that particular space. Some of them you go in and build a park, whereas there was bloodshed in that particular park, so you don't honor that. So what you need to do, understand every single space that you manage in that particular area. If you want to develop that space, talk to the community. Get to understand. Collaborate with academic institutions because they've got wealth of knowledge in terms of open space planning. Also, there's institute and there's organizations that are there. In South Africa, we've got the Institute of Environmental and Recreation. We've got the World Urban Parks, where you can start sharing ideas, sharing what happened in your country that you can be able to learn. But I think the biggest challenge that we have done in most especially young people is you just go into the community and build something, not knowing what they want. You feel like and we've done that where we go and pull strings and everything. People say, no, this is not what we want. We want a park where we can be able to rest. We want a park where we can be able to have our traditional dances. And as a young park manager, you have developed a soccer pitch or a netball pitch, whereas in that community, there's a big influence of traditional music. So you kind of like kill that. So as a young person or as a young park manager, understand your community, understand your open spaces, then you'll be able to work very well with those communities. If you don't, I promise you every single time you're gonna be complaining about vandalism of parks, vandalism of your infrastructure because you didn't give the indigenous people or the people of that community an opportunity to raise their voice to say this is, and also work with them, not against them. If you go and say, this is your park, this is your infrastructure, let's work together in that particular area, you will have an amazing park.
I can't think of a better way to close this session off then. Thank you, Bishop, and thank all of y'all for your heartfelt, your sensitive, and your thoughtful leadership in the space. For folks that are tuned in, and I see so many have stayed on the whole time, we will get out the PowerPoints from all the presenters to you shortly. We'll get a quick turnaround on that, and I'm sure they will be.
Hey, Scott, you just cut out right after saying about the PowerPoints. Great. Thank you, everyone. Scott's having some audio problems. We'll get the recordings and files out to you all and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Akitiano.
Ni madekwana.